Good morning, everybody. I'm John Missione. I'm the chairman of the Center for Domestic Violence and Against Domestic Violence, and I want to welcome you to our fifth, I can't believe it, this is our fifth educational breakfast where we bring to people like yourselves, important topics that relate to really violence in a number of forms, and we hope to sort of enlighten people and also, let them understand that these problems are they're widespread in our society, and hopefully this education will help us all think more about them. Before we start, we have some special guests from the Human Resource Administration, and I'd like to thank them for coming. Cecile Noel, the Executive Deputy Commissioner of Emergency and Intervention Centers. Tracy Thorne, I don't know where she is, who is the Director of Program and Policy Analysis, and Marie Phillip, who's the Executive Director for Domestic Violence Services. The city is a huge supporter in terms of our services, and we think we lead the way in new programming. We thank the city for its support of us over the years. Just briefly, a little bit on the center. We have been around since 1976. We have a three-pronged approach to eliminating violence: education, prevention, and intervention. We have over 210 beds. We've been in the business of rescuing people and providing them a safe haven for a very long time, and we think we have wonderful programming to help people sort of restart their lives in a safe and secure environment. In addition, as I said, I always say emergency surgery is something, but we really like to see it prevent, if you will, these problems from occurring. And, prevention requires a lot of effort. So we have a lot of educational programming. One of our premier programs is to educate children in the schools, basically from middle school through high school. That program is called RAP. We're going to have a RAP student here shortly. And in addition, we have a pilot program. And one of the things, if you do give us money, we innovate through creating pilot programs, which we do not do with city money. We do with the funds of the center. And one of our pilot programs is a program for young middle school children called Relationships Are Elementary. And again, the idea there is to get at these problems early and try to educate people early. So those are educational programs. And then we have programs for adults like this, where we share with you, we bring in leading thinkers, and we have them share with you their ideas about important problems that our society faces across all socioeconomic levels. I think the thing that we need to understand is this problem of violence in society in all of its forms, between men and women, between children, is not related to any one social class. And I think it's really important to raise consciousness around that. So let me just give you briefly the program. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from one of our RAP students, Devon Arnold, and then we're going to give some scholarship awards to two former RAP students, and we're going to award them with the Stuckey Family Scholarships, the annual ones, and then we're going to have our program where we're going to get into this whole issue of bullying and get thoughts from two esteemed professionals who have a real view and point of view on this. So, without further ado, let me introduce Devon Arnold, who will talk about how RAP helped him deal with being bullied. And he's a junior at Manhattan Theater Lab High School. He came to RAP for help. He participated in the RAP Summer Leadership Institute and is now a peer leader, which means he helps his fellow students, if you will, with issues that relate to being bullied and violence. Devon, here's the platform.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Devon Arnold. I am an 11th grader at Manhattan Theater Lab High School. I'm an active member of the Relationship of Youth Prevention program at my school, and I'm very passionate about acting and theater. I want to thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. It's truly an honor. I'd like to start off by saying that after joining the RAP program, my life has been great. It's hard to believe, but I started getting bullied in the 2nd grade. When I was approached by a group of boys that were my age. They criticized me and laughed at me, claiming that I had a girly voice. Since I was very young, I was also very confused. By the third grade, I was teased for being gay. Since I didn't have the slightest idea what that meant, I asked mom and dad. They explained it, and I remember thinking that, you know, a gay relationship was weird, but since I was 9, I was more confused and hurt that I was being made fun of and labeled because of my voice and who I was. I was being called something I don't identify as, and it caused me a lot of pain. Although I tried to move on, their words were like gum, and it stuck to me like concrete. I thought the entire situation would end, but in the 4th grade, it continued with even more harsh words. I was in the bathroom once when a group of boys who previously chastised me walked in. They laughed at my clothes, they called me the usual derogatory names, and then they gave me a nickname, Gayvon. One boy said, "Hey, Gayvon, are you gay?" And I immediately answered, "No." But oddly, they were not satisfied with my answer. They pushed me around, pushed me against the wall. They called me a faggot and said that no one liked me. Since previously teachers wouldn't help me when I told, I just keep it to myself. By 6th grade, I was immune to the words in the comments and the never-ending question. But that all changed when another student whispered in my ear that he was going to rape me. This sent terrifying thoughts through my mind, and I decided that I had to tell an adult. It was the scariest moment of my life. I told administration and I told my mom, and immediately it was dealt with. But I remember that after I told, while figuring out the situation, the school had me in the same room with him. I hated that I had to be in the same room with him. I didn't even want to look at him. It would be much later that I learned that the boy had said what he did because he was being sexually abused, and it had nothing to do with me. After this incident, I felt like my life was crashing around me. I felt unwanted and disliked, and it was all because of me, just simply being me. For the next couple of years, my depiction of myself was not good. It was based on what my peers had been saying to me for years. I always felt disliked by others. Last year, the rap program came to my school. Something about rap was just right, and the rap coordinator, Ellen, encouraged me to apply for the rap peer leadership program. I applied and was accepted, but little did I know that I would discover something about me that I've never had before. When the first day came, I immediately thought that my rap peers were thinking the same things as other students I had encountered in my past. But to my surprise, that wasn't true. In fact, all I felt this past summer was love and support. I discovered my voice and learned how to show and be proud of the Devon I am. Having straight and openly gay and bisexual students in my school, I learned the difference between gender and sexuality and how the two are often confused by others when even a transgender speaker come and talk to us about his experiences. It taught me so much. I learned that just because I am caring and sensitive male does not make me gay. I also learned that I need to stop trying to please others because in the end, it is me who needs to be happy. The Rap Summer program was the most incredible 6 weeks of my life, and I now feel like I now know who I am and where I stand. I believe people identify in many ways, and being straight, gay, bisexual, or transgendered doesn't matter when all you need is kindness, compassion, and respect for all. Thank you. Have an incredible day.
Devon, thank you very much. I think it's important for everybody to hear your story because stories convey a lot more to people when they hear them from people who have had these experiences. So thank you for sharing with us. Now I'm very, very happy. We have a fund, the Stuckey Scholarship Fund, where we basically give scholarships to further the careers of students who have come through our RAP program, and I'm happy to present 2 awards today. And let me see if I got them in the right order. The first is to Andrea Cruz Guerrero. This is a big check for $3,000. She's working at Kingsborough Community College, and she's working to become an ultrasound technician. And before this, you were at City College, or? I was going to go to City you were going to go to City College to study psychology. So, Amber, if you want to say a few words, and we're happy to give you the scholarship.
Thank you. So before I met Mr. Allison in my junior year of high school at Lincoln, which is back in Brooklyn, I lived a pretty hectic life. I have parents who, they don't get along sometimes, just like everybody. But, you have to stand up, you have to be, yourself and learn who you are and what you do. So I went as low as getting with someone who, didn't value me, disrespected me. So he pretty much broke me down verbally and emotionally. Meeting Mr. Allison was one of the best things that ever happened to me because he introduced me to rap. I gained the trust I always searched for with everyone. As time went on, he had asked me if I wanted to continue to be in the summer program. It was one of the best decisions of my life, actually. During the rap summer program, I learned so much about the rights and wrongs about respecting yourself and being respected by your partner. I knew by then that I was in the wrong spot and needed to get out of it because I knew I deserved way better than what I had settled for. I got to bond with everyone and got to see how people from all over the city came together to stop and learn about one thing: preventing domestic violence. I got to meet amazing people who I'm still friends with to this day, and I can say that if I was ever back in that low situation, I know they will be there for me in a heartbeat. I've grown to be a much stronger, more independent, confident young lady with the help of Mr. Allison, my old co-workers at the summer program, our mentors, Miss Rona, and everybody helping keep rap running. I gained the trust of people just like they have gained the trust of mine, and I help them out of any situation I can in any way I can. There are days where my negative memories come back, and I begin to feel as if I'm slipping back down. However, those times and days, I am beyond grateful to have experienced everything I went through because it led me to here, to this day, to keep moving and spreading the word of what I have learned. Thank you.
And our second scholarship goes to Amber Anise Perez. What are you studying? You could tell me. Psychology. Ah, okay. She is studying psychology at City College. So Amber, here again. You could put this in your wallet and take it over. Here you go. Congratulations.
Hello. So, like he said, my name is Amber Perez. I've been an active member of the Center Against Domestic Violence Relationship Abuse Prevention Program, also known as RAP, for 7 years. I joined RAP as a freshman at my high school, Bronx High School for Law and Community Service. And in the summer of 2006, I was given the honor of being chosen as a peer leader in the RAP Summer Peer Leadership Program. When I first started the RAP program, I didn't know what to expect. And to my surprise, it wasn't just a summer job. It was a group of people who became my family. I was never judged by what I said, and I could talk about my problems at home with people who supported me. RAP taught me about self-respect and how to prevent relationship abuse and bullying. I learned why teenagers bully each other and how we could effectively stand up to the bully. Now that I'm an adult, I know that RAP has forever changed my life. I had such a positive experience that I was invited back for a second summer as a mentor and even a third summer as a RAP assistant. I am thrilled and grateful to the Center Against Domestic Violence and the Stuckey family for awarding me the money for college. My path of life has not been easy. My dad has been incarcerated most of my life, and my mom raised me and my sister single-handedly. My mother's a recovering drug addict who's been clean for going on 20 years. She has been an inspiration to me, and she's shown me that no matter what, how bad life can be, you can always work hard and do better. She's always taught me to remain open-minded and to use her life as a prime example of what not to do. I have always tried my very hardest in school, but at the beginning of high school, me and my family were homeless for 2 years. Sometimes we didn't know where our next meal would come from. Sorry. This did distract me a bit from school, and once I noticed that my grades were not up to par to the student that I know I could be, I decided to do something about it. Sorry. So, with the help of extracurricular activities and tutoring and RAP, Ellen Fields, I graduated valedictorian of my high school. Thank you. And I was the first of my family to go to graduate high school and to go to college. I enrolled in City College and I started working at the Gap to pay for tuition and for books. Although working part-time and going to school full-time is very challenging, I did keep my grades up to par. But unfortunately, me and my mom disagreed about work and school. She felt that it was more important to, work and help pay bills, and I thought it was more important to get an education. So I decided to move out on my own just so I can make sure our school is going to be my first priority. This scholarship is an incredible gift, and I am majoring in clinical psychology and plan on getting my doctorate. I am very thankful to the Center Against Domestic Violence and the Stuckey family for helping me pay for school, but most importantly, for believing in me. Thank you.
Before I introduce the panel, I have one important function, which is that we do have donation cards at the tables. And I just want to get rid of this business aspect first. I ask people for money for a living in terms of my business, but if you could think of our innovation, we do have a funder in the sense of the city, but some of the greatest stuff that we've done is through things that have come out of thinking and our staff thinking about more things that we could do. So anything that you'd be willing to give, we'd really appreciate. And if you want to get connected to us, there's an email list so that we could communicate with you about our programming. At this point, I'm really excited to get the speakers talking, and I'm going to introduce the first speaker. And Emily, I don't know how to say your last name. It's Bazelon?
It's Bazelon.
Emily Bazelon. She's a senior editor at Slate, a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and the Truman Capote Fellow for Creative Writing and Law at Yale Law School. She has just written a book, and that book is in the back, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that today. And with her is Dr. Elizabeth Lasky. She is a rap coordinator at a Manhattan intermediate school. She recently finished a children's book about bullying, and her dissertation focused on cyberbullying. I'm very excited to hear the panel, and I'll give it over to you two. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming. We're so excited to have you.
My pleasure.
One of the things that I was thinking about when I was preparing for our conversation was setting an intention for our conversation today. And it made me want to start with asking you, what was your intention and what was behind writing your book? And what was perhaps, what was the inspiration behind it and what was your intention?
Well, I'm a journalist, so I'm always looking for issues and stories that are kind of bubbling up and are opportunities to explore the things I'm interested in. And I'm also a parent. I have two boys who are 10 and 13. And I think this issue was right at the nexus between my professional and personal interests. So a few years ago, I noticed that there were a lot of stories bubbling up in the news about bullying. A lot of them involved the internet, and I think the fear that this new technology was creating opportunities for kids to hurt each other that hadn't existed before. And because we all didn't grow up with this technology, it was also this kind of big question mark to adults about how to deal with it.
For sure.
And I know that I was asking those questions too as a mother. My kids now are at the age where they're asking for access to a lot of to phones and to social media. And I was anticipating that a few years ago. And I really wanted to have a better sense of the answers that I wanted to give them.
And how old are your kids?
My kids are 10 and 13. I have two boys. And what I basically decided pretty early on was that this attention to bullying was kind of an excuse to try to think about how to make kids' lives better. That all the attention bullying is getting is really like a lens into teen culture, figuring out how to make schools places that are more supportive of kids, and also parents and increasingly the social media companies themselves, trying to think about the different roles all these actors could and should be playing in kids' lives.
We'll get into that for sure. Great, thank you. And for me, I was thinking, and what we wanted to hear from you really is I thought and I guess my intention for this conversation comes in 3 parts. And the first, I'd like to just sort of get a state of the union in a sense of what's going on in the bullying world. And then I'd love to know some of your thoughts and responding to some of the issues that you just brought up right now, and then finish up with some next steps and sort of what we can do, and when we walk out of this room, some empowering steps that we can take. So I guess my first question to you is, can you define bullying for us and how you see it, and include cyberbullying in that definition
Sure.
as well?
So there's a lot of debate over this question, and I actually think it's an interesting debate, and people have different ideas of the answer. The way I think about it is that it's really important to have a limited definition of bullying, one that captures what we really know is most likely to cause harm. So the definition that most psychologists have been working with for about 40 years is verbal or physical abuse or harassment that is repeated over time and involves a power imbalance. And what I find useful about those 3 elements is that it helps separate bullying from one-off fights, which can be bad, but aren't necessarily bullying, and also separate what is usually more harmful from what kids often call drama, which usually to them means a social conflict that's going back and forth in terms of the power dynamic. It may get nasty, it may be that adults need to intervene, but there isn't necessarily a real campaign to make one kid miserable. It's that idea that has really been linked to a number of adverse consequences for kids, lower grades, problems with substance abuse, and then even on into adulthood, strikingly higher rates of anxiety disorders and depression and suicidal thinking. And a lot of the risk factors I just mentioned apply to kids who are bullied, to the victims, but also sometimes to the kids who do the bullying. And in particular, there's a vulnerable group of kids who are called in the psych literature bully victims, who are both. They tend to be the kids who have more serious psychological problems and are having a lot of trouble socially. And so they lash out sometimes, and then other times they end up on the receiving end. And for them, I think this behavior is really a cry for help. It's not true about all kids who bully, but that group in particular is vulnerable.
I definitely agree with you about the definition piece, because we see these schools where they have 0 tolerance. For example, my niece goes to a school in New Jersey, and if you don't want to play with a kid on the playground, that's considered bullying, even if it happens one time. And a lot of schools are so concerned with making a mistake and not addressing the bullying in an appropriate way that they've made these policies that I think sometimes are doing a disservice to us because it's not necessarily bullying. So I think you bring up a really good point about that, that the tighter the definition, the better for us, because it is a very specific thing.
Right.
So 2 things I take away from what you said is is that it's repetitive, and that there's a power imbalance and a power dynamic.
I think that's true. You know, you mentioned New Jersey. New Jersey, unfortunately, is not such a great example in terms of the way the legislation happened there. And they did adopt this very broad definition.
Right.
And it has come down to schools in this way where I have also heard a lot of stories about one gesture or teasing that someone else sees and misinterprets the intention of being called bullying and then reported. And there's, once you have that label in schools, you can set in motion this whole bureaucratic process. And I think what we see here is an example of the pendulum swinging too far. So, and I also worry about the disservice. I think, first of all, it's not realistic. Teachers and administrators feel that, but mostly kids feel that. And if you tell kids that, you know, you have to play with everybody on the playground, that's not how adult life is either. People do group in natural ways. We have to think about how realistic we're being and what we're asking of kids, right?
Absolutely. And I think also, and I hope to come back to this later, I think also children learn how to develop emotionally through disagreement and what it feels like to disagree with somebody. So when we grow up and we're grown-ups, we get to say, no, thanks, I'm not coming to your dinner party, but thanks so much for inviting me, right? Those are skills that we have to learn,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay, so you bring up the term bully and victim. And I was wondering how you felt about those terms, because I'm a social worker and I work at a middle school. And sometimes I'm concerned about using those words, because sometimes I feel like we're pathologizing being a bully and being a victim. And, you know, even at the Center Against Domestic Violence, where we work with abusers and we work with victims of domestic violence, sometimes I feel like, you know, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy at times when we call a kid, oh, that kid's a bully, when they're in kindergarten. And then, of course, by the time they get to 8th grade, oh, I remember him from kindergarten. He was a bully then, too. So how do you feel about using those words?
Nouns are a problem, right? Because they create this, exactly what you're saying, this fixed identity,
Yes.
a label that's hard to escape. Luckily, almost everyone is not a bully forever, in the sense that most kids will have some capacity to feel empathy and to be some version of their better self. So I completely agree with you. The label of victim also is not such a
Absolutely.
great one to kind of cling to. People who really hold on to an identity of victimhood have more trouble being resilient, and that's not healthy either. So I completely understand what you're saying. I also think this is sort of a failure of imagination on our part in the way we use language. I rarely use the word bully in my book, because once I got to know the kids involved, I was really reluctant to label them in that way. And yet, when you're talking in generalities, it's really hard not to have a few nouns once in a while. So I have not become someone who just refuses to ever use the noun at all.
Right.
It's
Yeah, it
sort
is
of
certainly
a shorthand.
helpful in some ways.
Yeah, but I think you're right. When you're talking to individuals, it's actually really helpful to stay away from those labels, and I think better for kids. And one thing I hear a lot from teachers and administrators is that once you call a kid a bully, you've kind of lost their parents. It's very hard
Yes.
for parents to hear that about their kids, and then instead of being able to focus on the behavior that needs to improve, you're in this moment of trying to kind of get around the barrier the word has created.
Certainly. So, okay, so what are the stats? How prominent is this? How is it really going on in schools? And how much of it, I guess, is real bullying, so to speak?
So, yes, there is definitely real bullying happening, but it is not epidemic, which is something I think we get the impression of sometimes from the media coverage. And it also isn't actually really, the rates aren't rising. So there have been people doing studies internationally in different countries asking the same sets of questions about bullying for 25 years. And when you look at the rates in general, you see that between 10 and 25% of kids, depending on the country, are involved in bullying in some way. So that means either as targets or as kids who are acting like bullies, or both. So we're not talking about the majority of kids. And that is actually really important, both because it shows this is not some like completely intractable, massive, overwhelming problem that everybody has. And also, it helps kids see, when you reinforce that this is not like a normal thing to do. Most kids don't bully, and most kids don't like bullying. And there's some really, I find, heartening studies talking about the power of social norming, that if kids understand that, if they don't see this as something that everyone does, then actually they tend to do it even less. It's a way of kind of, instead of normalizing their behavior, making it seem more like an outlier.
Definitely. Now, you brought up the media, and do you think that, or why do you think, I guess, it's so inflated by the media?
Well, I think one of the things that happens is when a story breaks in the news, it tends to have really dramatic facts, right? So I don't know how many of you have been reading this week about these two kids in Florida, seeing a few nods, who just were charged criminally with the felony of aggravated stalking after the suicide of a girl who they were, according to the police, bullying online. And at least one of the kids was writing some really mean stuff. So you read the mean things she wrote because of the internet. It's this permanent record. It's not disappearing into the air, her speech, in a way that is much more ephemeral. It's there. We're all kind of stuck with it. And then you hear about this suicide of this awful event, this poor 12-year-old girl, And it seems really scary. And then there are these very serious consequences in which these two kids who've been charged are basically being made an example of. And it all seems incredibly alarming, and it seems very black and white. We have this like poor innocent victim, and we have these kids who seem kind of monstrous, in fact. The story usually gets told by the victim's parents, because the other parents no one either knows who they are, because the identity of the kids are hidden at first to the reporters, or even if you did know who they are, they may not want to speak out because their kids are kind of the ones who behaved badly. And the school basically can't say anything, because the school, according to federal privacy laws, cannot explain how they disciplined the kids involved. They can't say anything, really, about the dynamics among the kids. And then the other actor you have in stories like this is the police, who will come forward, who are outraged by what has happened, and will say something that, again, casts this in a very black and white way. It's really hard for the media to get past that surface story. And sometimes it may be that even if you spent a month there, you would conclude this much of what I just laid out. Like, yes, you really do have these kids who just seem awful. But usually, when you dig beneath the surface, it's more complicated what was going on. And these categories of kind of total innocence and complete evil start to become more of a gray area, right? Because in life, there is much more gray area. Luckily, there is not a whole lot of like real evil going on among kids. I mean, I don't want to say it doesn't exist, but the notion that it's everywhere, I think it's really not true. It takes a lot of work for reporters to go back in and try to figure out the underlying dynamics. Interviewing kids is tricky, whether they really have the judgment to be talking to you. How do you make sure that what you're doing is fair to them, because they're not adults and you have to be really careful. And not that many news organizations are really interested. There's not a whole lot of, if you think about it from a pure business standpoint, it's much easier to put together 5 minutes of TV that has very harrowing footage than it is to go in and tell this complicated story. I was actually watching, I wasn't listening, but I was watching Good Morning America while I was exercising this morning, and it was exactly this 5-minute story that was unfolding. And you finish it feeling totally upset and also really angry. And then that's it. It just feels hopeless, and you don't really have any sense of the underlying dynamics. Every time I go into schools and talk to the adults who actually deal with situations like this, they find this so frustrating, because they know it is almost never that story. And yet that dominant black and white narrative is the one that, particularly television, but I think a lot of the media tends to put out there, and there just aren't a lot of checks and balances against it.
And you write a lot about that in your book as well. And I imagine sometimes people might not like you when they hear you say something like that, because it's such an easy pill to swallow. This kid was bullied, and then this kid, killed herself, and that's the story. Bullying is terrible. We have to do something about it. And I see in my practice as well that it is certainly more complicated than that. And we find out from these students who have in fact committed suicide, and there are so many mental health issues involved, previous attempts, suicidal ideation for many years, depression, anxiety, self-harm, so on and so on. But I still think that there's some reason that we just don't want to look at that. We don't want to look at the complexity of the issue. And it makes me wonder who's to blame, perhaps, or how to make sense of that. Is it the media then? Is it the parents? Is it the students? Is it the people who work in the school? What makes it so difficult to look at the complexities of bullying?
Well, I think there are lots of factors swirling around, and everybody kind of plays a role. But one thing I think tends to be a pattern is that when events are up close, when you personally know the people involved and have a sense of their network of relationships and the reality of human experience, which is so varied, then you see all the gray area. But when you're at a remove from something, when it's happening not in your town, not in your state, and you just read about it in a headline, in a story that is really usually coming from one point of view, then it's much easier to project the good and evil narrative onto it. In fact, it's kind of comforting in some way, or at least it allows you to have this feeling of moral righteousness. You know who the good and the bad guy is. That's something about bullying stories where, right, in the movies, what happens at the end of the movies about bullies? The bully gets punched in the face and is vanquished, and we all cheer. In writing my book, started rewatching a bunch of movies from the 80s that I remembered. It's the same narrative in all these movies, and we feel really good at the end of them. The other stuff going on doesn't allow for that same kind of sense of release I think we get from these stories. So I think some of it has to do with our psychology, and then the media will always kind of play into this, right? Because
they have a story
it's
to sell.
A business, exactly.
And, you know, you bring up movies, and this is something that comes up for me a lot too, because, you know, we want to engage children in conversations like this, and it could be through a conversation or through a movie or things like that. And I notice so much that these new movies and shows about bullying and cyberbullying are ending up, the end is a child tries to commit suicide, somebody finds them, and then it's a reintegration back into school, into the community, and how their life ends up, and everyone is happy at the end of the day. And to be honest, to me, that is infuriating, because I don't believe that bullying prevention is synonymous with suicide prevention. They are not the same. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, and how you, and your thoughts about clumping suicide and bullying together, and the goods and the bads about that.
Right. So, well, one of the things I really have tried to get people to think more about is the whole idea of the bully side narrative. This very
Which I
simple,
hate that word.
Yes, me too.
And a lot of it, a lot of the academics really try to make such a strong point that we should not be using the word bully side and be using suicide by bullying.
Yeah. Well, or even to be making more of a separation.
Yes.
You know, so essentially I have not spoken to any expert who is kind of behind the idea that we can say with confidence in specific cases or generally that bullying causes suicide. So we know there's a link. I don't mean to be completely pulling back from that.
Correlation, perhaps.
There's a correlation. We don't know, though, whether kids who are suicidal are more likely to be bullied, and then that makes them more depressed. Or we don't. It's not a cause and effect dynamic. We know that there is a link, and that it's a risk factor. However, it's not the major risk factor. Really, when kids are at real risk of suicide, it's because of depression. And that is obviously can be related to bullying, but there are a lot of other causes for it. And so I think one concern, and maybe this is what you were referring to, is that when we talk about preventing bullying for the sake of, preventing suicide, it's not actually the direct track that we would want to go on, because unfortunately, the problem of suicide is much more complicated. And so if you start making it all about preventing bullying, you miss all these other causes that are going on that we just aren't picking up and seeing so much right now, because this bully side narrative is looming very large in the consciousness and in the media coverage. It's playing too dominant a role. And so I worry then that suicide prevention, which is much more about mental health treatment and these kind of long-term interventions, which are not new or sexy but have been shown to work, that they're sort of falling by the wayside as we kind of get more, as we're sort of watching this new exciting phenomenon unfold. I think that is a real concern.
And do you find that, I even think that is lessening a little in terms of our obsession with the bullying and our obsession with the suicide and the bullying. Do you think that's sort of calming down a little bit?
I hope so.
It reminds me in some ways of how no one wanted to fly after 9/11.
And then people sort of
and we were in this crisis state, and then it calmed down a little bit.
I think that you're right. So when I started writing about this a few years ago, I wrote a lot about a girl who had committed suicide named Phoebe Prince, who was sort of the first national story. It was an incredibly sad story, but kids were also criminally charged with really serious felony charges after her death, and there was this sort of tidal, the swell of outrage. And when I really went in and researched that story and decided and figured out that it was much more complicated what had gone on. Phoebe had a complicated mental health history. The power dynamics among her and the other kids who were charged had gone back and forth. When I wrote about all of that, there was a lot of outrage. I mean, not among experts, but among people. Like, if you go back and read the comments on Slate to those stories, people were furious. And so I felt that really strongly. I feel like now when I write about this and try to just keep saying that it's more complicated, that I don't get that same wellspring of outrage, that more people are willing to say, oh yeah, maybe it is more complicated. Maybe it doesn't make sense to keep telling these stories only in one way. You know, actually I know a kid and it was more complicated in that situation, so maybe it doesn't make sense to trust this oversimplified narrative that I'm seeing on TV. I do think there's some of that.
Do you think that we're perhaps getting desensitized a little bit?
Well, maybe. I mean, what I think is really important is to not have these dominant narratives make it seem like it is a normal thing to kill yourself because you've been bullied. It's not. Luckily, that almost never happens. And if we start sending the message to kids, and I worry that some movies, TV shows, and media coverage does this, like, this is normal. This is an expected response. And look, like, this kid is famous. Her picture is all over television. That's when you really see a risk of suicide contagion. The problem of suicide copycats as kids see suicides becoming, it seems like an appealing idea. It's a way to get, you don't really imagine that you're going to be dead. You know, imagine all of the attention that you would get if you were this person who, it's really scary to me, that part of it. And I think that the coverage does veer in that direction sometimes.
And that piece, I think, also is quite developmental in terms of being an adolescent and this fear or lack of fear about living forever, and how a teenager doesn't necessarily understand really how finite it is.
Right. So one of the facts that has really always stuck with me about the Phoebe Prince case is that right before Phoebe Prince hanged herself, she plugged in her cell phone to recharge it. There's like some disconnect there that is, even saying it, it's like very chilling. But I think you're right. Teenagers, I mean, a lot of people who commit suicide don't really understand or necessarily fully grasp what they're doing. And I think particularly with kids and the way that their brains haven't completely developed, we see that problem of impulsivity and not thinking through consequences.
So about this idea of development and the developmental stage, you know, one of the main developmental tasks of an adolescent is to be part of a peer group. And I wonder often the connection between the development piece and the bullying piece, and the importance of being in a group and doing whatever the group is doing. And if, for example, the group is bullying another kid, some people say that bullying is just part of the developmental process and just an adolescent thing.
Right, so I strongly disagree with that. No matter how many radio hosts insist on this. This is like my, you know, over and over again I get on the radio with some usually older person who's like, oh, come on, you really wrote a whole book about this?
Right.
And I always say, yes, I did, because look, let's break this down. We're not talking about like one kid once stealing your kid's lunch money. We're talking about kids really going after each other, and in a way that creates real vulnerability. So we do, and most kids will recover from this, right? Thank goodness. Most people are resilient. But some kids won't, and we don't know in advance who's who, and so we need to take this problem seriously.
But what about you know, people saying, but this happens in adolescence?
So what happens in adolescence is conflict, for sure, and kids need to learn how to manage conflict. But that doesn't mean that, you know, extended cruelty where, you know, you're really trying to grind one person down, that does not need to be a normal part of adolescence. That is what I resist. And I think that when you're in an environment, whether it's your school culture or your community, in which that is not tolerated, people are better off. Like, there's a sense of well-being. Kids feel a sense of connection to their school, to the adults around them. there is more support. There is a way in which you can rise in the social ranks for being kind instead of for being mean, right? I mean, one reason that kids bully is that they see it as a route to power and popularity. It's not a good decision, but it's a rational one. And so then it's up to us to upend that dynamic rather than accepting it and saying, this is just always going to be with us. I'm not saying we're going to eradicate bullying, but we could certainly reduce it and make it something that's just not socially acceptable.
Yeah, and I think people really are just looking for an answer. I think people are really just want to know, why is this happening?
Right, right.
And
yes.
they might just fall back on, it's a teenage thing, it's a kid thing.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Although it's really not a kid thing. I mean, people deal with bullies in the workplace and as adults as well. That's something
You know,
I hear
that's
about a lot.
something that I've read that you've said before too, about this idea of an adult bully. And that has been quite controversial in the field and controversial in the research as well. A lot of people say that you can only be bullied or be in a bullying dynamic up until the age of 18, and after 18 it's considered harassment. But you talk about bullying in the workplace and things like this, so I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit too.
Well, I don't really think the categories of bullying and harassment are separate. They're, whether for better or worse, those words have kind of bled into each other.
Certainly the dynamic is the same, but I think people still prefer to keep bullying to children and adolescents, 18 and under.
Maybe. I mean, my sense is that the research on what's called workplace bullying or workplace harassment is a mess. The definitions are all over the place. I can't make sense of it. When I go in and read the papers, some people are defining this in one way, some in another way. The rates are all over the place. There are advocacy groups which I think kind of want to inflate the statistics to make it seem as if this is happening all the time in some way that if it were true, like we'd all be really miserable. I don't really believe in that. And also in this country in particular, we have a strong sense of at-will employment and of giving supervisors some latitude to get their point across, even in a harsh way. So I'm not sure how to make sense of all of that myself. Maybe that's part of what you're talking about.
So I would like to know how you respond to people when they come up to you and they say two questions, because I think each of these questions hold different weight. So the first question is, my child is a victim. And then my second question is, and maybe I don't even know if you get this question, my child is a bully.
I do. I get both of those.
So
yeah.
how do you respond to that?
Well, people then say, like, what should I do, right? So I'm not a psychologist. I try to make that clear. But what I do say is that if you think your kid is a victim of bullying, it's really important to get the whole story, to make sure that that's what's happening, to have all the facts for yourself so you make sure. And also because if you're going to go to bat for your kid as an advocate, you'll have more credibility if you really can tell the story from what happened. And then the second thing I say, and I have stolen this from a school psychologist at the school I went to when I was a kid, is don't interview for pain. In other words, don't sort of assume things are worse than they are. Like in the same way when our kids are little and they scrape their knee, don't make them burst into tears by kind of doing it for them, anticipating that. I think those are both really important. And then I also think that we need to involve kids in the problem solving. So, you know, sometimes adults will say, oh, well, I tried this and I thought that would be a great idea and it didn't work. And I say, well, did you talk to your kid about it? Because first of all, you're going to more likely to come up with a solution that might work if your child is part of thinking it through. And second of all, you're building the capacity for resilience, right? I mean, resilience is believing you can overcome this adversity that is happening to you. If you are part of crafting the solution, then that turns this bad experience into one that can actually have some healthy effect on development.
Yeah, and I see grown-ups every day, every single day, try and come up with these elaborate plans for these kids to do. And really, if you say to a child, what do you want to do? They have an even better idea than you had, and it's something that's going to work for them. And I think for some reason, we get so anxious about it. The grown-ups get so anxious, and we just want to jump and do something. But asking the child sometimes is more powerful, exactly like you were saying. Okay, so then what do you say? We're going to take audience questions? Is that what you want to do? Okay, come on over. And what about if my child is the bully?
So when people ask me about that, I ask them what they're doing to really instill empathy in their kids. One thing I do at home with my kids, and it's not some great strategy, I'm sure a lot of you do it too, is we read a lot of stories and sometimes see movies where the characters are different from my kids and they're going through struggles, and the literature allows my kids to think through what it's like to be someone else who's having problems. And sometimes there are stories that are directly about this issue. So there's a great book for younger elementary school kids called Wonder, which some of you may know, which is about a disabled kid who has been homeschooled and goes to regular school for the first time. What I love about that book is it's told from multiple points of view. And some of the kids who are narrating chapters do really terrible, cruel things, but the main character forgives them and is an incredibly resilient person himself. And so you see the complicated human dynamics. It is not a simple black and white story. I've had some success, or I've heard of, I should say, teachers and parents using my book, the stories in it, to try to talk to kids. Because again, you have these, it's not a didactic narrative, right? And kids know bullying is wrong. They know the answer to that question. However, they're acting. They don't need to be told that. They need to have an opportunity to think through real life situations with three-dimensional characters who are making choices, and to think about what choices they might make and how they could change things. And I think if you're trying to reach kids and help build their sense of empathy, literature and the movies and TV can be a really powerful tool for that.
And I think one of the things that we don't do enough is talk about what it feels like also to be the bully and explore that through different ways, because we're so quick to help the victim. And there's a lot of reluctance to address the bully. And we want to just punish them and say, this was bad and you did bad and you're bad. But you know, when we talk even about suicide and we talk about depression and anxiety, the children who are put in the bully category and who are perpetrators of the violence are suffering very similar things to some of these victims and targets of the bullying. And I think that's a really important point too, because they're half of the problem as well. And I don't think that we pay enough attention to that. Okay, on that note, we're going to move to some audience questions. And this one I think is so interesting. Do you think that self-esteem correlates with bullying? And I'm going to add something here, both as a victim and as a bully.
Yes, but it's more complicated than that. Sort of my answer to everything.
Yep.
So it is true that victims of bullying tend to be kids who are physically weaker and less assertive than other kids, and sometimes that also ties into lower self-esteem. And it's also true that some kids who bully, particularly those bully victim category kids we were talking about before.
Which is a huge group.
Which is a real problem group. They're not huge. Nobody's huge in the sort of, but yes, they're really
Well, they're big in the sense that, you know, in some
they do a lot of damage.
They do a lot of damage.
I just don't want to, they're not,
No,
they're like 5% of the population. That's what I'm trying to.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're not creating this sort of sense that there's very troubled kids are everywhere. Sorry. So those kids often do have self-esteem issues too. However, there's some kids who are bullying because they're, as I was saying before, finding a way to be more popular by being really mean. And they don't necessarily have self-esteem issues. One of the girls in my book, whose name is Marina, had this great moment where she was talking about 8th grade and these, you know, wealthy, privileged boys who were really being cruel to her about her sexuality. And she said, you know, the notion that they didn't feel good about themselves, like, that's ridiculous. They felt great about themselves. That was not the problem. So I think it's just really important not to think of this as a monolithic picture in which one psychological dynamic explains everybody's behavior.
Certainly. So one of these questions has to do with empathy. And I've heard you say before that empathy is certainly part of this mix. So how do you think we can teach children to develop empathy? And this person wrote, how do we rediscover the power of empathy? And to add a layer to that, how do you think that the cyber world might add a complexity to that?
Yeah, that's a good issue to bring in. So this is something that I worry about a lot in terms of kids increasing socialization on social media and texting. Because when you're using the computer or your phone to communicate, you don't have the same face-to-face cues for empathy that you do in real life. And some of the incredibly cruel things kids write online or by text, I just don't think they would ever say in real life.
Oh,
They're
definitely
just
not.
senses. You don't say, like, "Can you die, please," to someone's face. That's like a, and so there's some research that supports this that really shows that the kids who are spending many, many hours socializing online tend to have less good feelings about their friendships and less of a sense of kind of healthy emotional development. So I think this is a real challenge being posed by the way in which kids are growing up, because when you look at the statistics about how they socialize outside of school, there is no question that texting and social media are dominating more and more. This is the way kids are communicating. You know, every time I talk about this, someone will mention the two teenagers who were like texting across from the table from each other, or, you know, next to each other on the couch. Like, it's really a part of their lives in a way that is changing, I think, their opportunities for empathy, making it even more important that we give them pathways for learning this so that they hang on to that when they go online, because
And
the
a lot
online
of
world just doesn't lend itself. Sorry.
And a lot of people say, well, then let's just take the technology away.
Yeah, well, so that's not realistic. I
At
mean,
all. It's not.
I'm all for delaying access to technology, I will say. Like,
Okay.
I mean, I really do feel like we have, as collectively, made a mistake by giving iPhones to 8-year-olds, by seeing access to the most sophisticated technology at the youngest age as the way to go. I just don't, honestly, with my own kids, I do not see why my 13-year-old needs to walk around with the internet and a computer in his pocket. Why? Like, it just doesn't seem like a good idea to me. He's a good kid, but you know what? Even if I wasn't worried about the social dynamic, the idea of all the time that he would be wasting would bother me just on its own. So I do think that delaying this and really thinking about what kids are ready for developmentally is important, especially vulnerable kids.
Yeah.
You know, because you can think of their phone as like this risk that they're carrying around with them.
Definitely. And on top of that, I think the way that we are social is changing.
Yes.
And it's not, as you've been saying, it's not as black and white as, you know, I don't know if they should have it or not, or they shouldn't. I'm making this decision. I think it's much more complicated because as a society, we're changing the way that we are social. And having that phone in your pocket, you know, whether you're 8 or whether you're 15, could hold a different weight. And it will, I think, end up being a barrier to social emotional development in the long run. And in a way, we're going to have to see how that plays out. I don't think any of us really know.
True.
And can't really make a guess because it's unprecedented.
Right, and also, I mean, we're a little stuck here between a rock and a hard place, right? So I just like made this big statement about my 13-year-old. However, I should make clear, he has a phone. We call it a dumb phone. It's a phone that makes phone calls. He has zero interest in that. Has, I think, never done that. Doesn't answer it. Doesn't really know, like, didn't set up his voicemail. That's not happening. But he texts on it.
Yes.
And that, when that started happening, look, it's a little rotten to have your mother be the author of this book as you're, you know, entering adolescence.
Absolutely.
He was just like, oh my God. Poor child. But when it started, of course, as I was watching this a little nervously, what I decided was that to deny him this entirely was to take away from him this whole area of social capital. Like, literally, it would have been saying, almost, you know what, outside of school, you can't have any friends, because this is the way the kids are building their friendships. And also, in my house, in a nice way, I don't know, I may be a little rosy about this, but I don't think so. So when Eli, my son, first got his phone, I was actually like checking his messages a little bit. In the beginning, not constantly, I didn't want to be hovering over every single one, but my feeling was this was like a new thing. I wanted to make sure. And one thing I've noticed, it's remained true, is he actually texts a lot with girls. Not girls as far as I can tell, doesn't seem flirty to me, most of it, but it's a way in which he can actually have friendships with girls, which I actually think is really nice. So I don't mean to suggest that I'm like a complete Luddite about this. I'm not. I just think that there is this I'm always looking for the sensible middle ground on this one as well.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask one more question and then wrap up, if that's okay. So we got a couple questions like this of what do I do the next time someone starts bothering me or someone starts bullying me? What can I do about that?
Well, I think one thing that's really useful is you don't have to decide when you're feeling under attack or when you see something mean happening. You don't have to define it as bullying, right? You don't have to make all these decisions before you decide what to do. I really like the mantra, when it's mean, intervene. That you're setting the tone, right? And especially as an adult dealing with kids, but maybe in your own life too, that you're just gonna, it's not that you're gonna immediately suspend people or like call in the, 5-alarm fire, but you just want to live in a world in which people are behaving with decent civility and compassion, and you want to be promoting that ethic. And so if you feel like someone's bothering you, then you want to have a response to it that matches the degree to which that's happening. So if it's serious, then you respond more. But I think in small ways in the moments, we can diffuse a lot of this stuff. And one thing I see a lot with teachers who have a real sense of this in their classrooms, because teachers can be really savvy and good about this, is they just know how to kind of quickly deflect things so that the power a kid is amassing by being mean just kind of goes away. Like maybe a teacher was telling me a story the other day about a kid who had spoken up in class and he had used a word incorrectly. So it wasn't proper grammar. And this other kid was repeatedly correcting. And so then the teacher said, I think it's fine. And the kid who was correcting said, but wait, it's don't you care about correct? And she said, I just don't think that's the main thing going on right now, and kind of went back to her business. So she wasn't being cutting or sarcastic or going over the top, but just sort of in the moment figuring out a way to let the kids know that she just wasn't going to tolerate that.
Great. So unfortunately, our time's coming to an end. And Emily, I got to admit, I was nervous talking to you today, and let me tell you why. But actually, once I got here, I was fine. But before I got here and before I read your book, I was a little bit nervous because I'm often on these panels, and I'm often talking to these authors and talking to people in the field, and I can't stand them.
Okay. And I hope this isn't where this is going to end.
Good night, folks. No, just kidding. And I'll tell you why. Because I'm always the one no one likes to have me on a panel. Because
really?
I'm always
you
the one.
seem great.
Well, because I'm always the one, I don't know, can I say shit disturber here? I mean, I'm the shit disturber. I just had shit disturber at a breakfast, right? So I'm always the one saying, I don't think we're really addressing the right issue. I don't think that, having a fight with someone who's the head of, the Department of Education didn't fall in love with me, because I don't think that we're addressing bullying in an appropriate way. And I think I'm always meeting these people who just have no idea what they're talking about.
I see.
And there's a huge problem with almost the right hand talking to the left hand. So the researchers and the people who are doing the work on the ground, really in the schools, and these people who are creating these programs and writing these books and making these movies who really don't have any idea what's going on. And I was so happily surprised to read your book and really fall in love with it. And I thought that you did such incredible work, and it was such a pleasure, and it was so refreshing. And there was one paragraph that really made me fall in love with you a little bit. So I was hoping that you could read it to us, and we can end that way.
That's so nice. Thank you so much, Liz. That's so lovely to hear. I really appreciate that.
So it's from there and there.
Okay. My kids are 13 and 10, and I'm never sure I'm getting any of this right. Building relationships, offline, online. Lately, I've taken to letting my older son walk or bike by himself to a friend's house. It's exactly 6 blocks away. I've also let him have limited email privacy while talking to him about what he's writing and to whom. By limited, I mean that I promise not to read messages to a particular close friend if he asked me not to. I'm feeling my way here, like everyone else, but I am as concerned about doing too much as I am about doing too little, because, as hard as it is to recognize this, my boys have to learn to fend for themselves. They have to figure out when it makes sense to push back against cruelty or to hold their own worst impulses in check. They have to figure out when to ask for help and when to intervene on behalf of someone who needs it. I can take every opportunity they give me to weigh in or coach from the sidelines, but I can't take them out of life's game. That's why character and empathy are the qualities I care most about instilling in my children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily and Liz. And now Judy Kahan, our Executive Director and CEO, is going to have a few ending words.
Hi, folks. Thank you, Emily. And I just discovered I'm an MOS, mother over shoulder.
You never knew that.
I never knew that one. Well, I also live in a different world. Hi, my name is Judith Kahan, and I am the CEO of the Center Against Domestic Violence. I am strongly committed to our prevention programs. We see too much in the news, which we've discussed today, about young people in abusive relationships, young people who are victims of bullying, young men and women whose lives are changed forever by sexual violence. After this morning's discussion and meeting, Devon, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Amber and Andrea, I am more confident than ever that the Center's Relationship Abuse Prevention Program, known as RAP, is teaching young people important lessons that help them to live happier and healthier lives. The Center's Relationships Are Elementary program is the only one of its kind in the nation, and it is completely funded by people like you. We are teaching children at 8 about consent, about being responsible bystanders, and the skills they need to avoid becoming abused, not avoid becoming abusers. To avoid becoming victims or bullies, each of you has an envelope in your program. I hope you will consider supporting our valuable programs, and thank you. I'd like to take a few minutes to recognize Nathaniel Glasser, who will be running the marathon, a board member in behalf of the agency. Wanda Lucy Bello. Assistant Wanda Lucy Bello, former Chair Ellen Marshall, and Vice Chair Audrey Meredith are here this morning. The center will be honoring these exceptional women April 10th of 2014. Finally, I'd like staff and board to stand so we can give you applause for this excellent program. And we have Emily's books, I believe, which
Yes,
Emily
and I
have signed.
them.
So, thank you very much.